Mr. Chair.
Great. Welcome back to House Education. We are very excited to welcome the State Treasurer, Mike Pieciak, and really a topic that is on many people's minds to discuss our school facilities needs across the state, which we're familiar with, but of course that all comes with a price tag. And I hope that that's an area where the Treasurer is going to be speaking today as well. So Mike, the floor is yours, and thanks for joining us.
Well, yeah, thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and thank you to the committee for having us. I do want to just introduce a couple other folks that are joining me remotely. Scott Baker is our Director of Financial Reporting and our individual that handles all debt management within the Treasurer's office, so our point person on bond issuances and all things bonding and debt management in our office. And then Ashlyn Doyon is our Director of Policy and Financial Literacy and Special Projects, but our point person in the legislature for any issues that you might have, if it's legislative testimony requests or information that you might need for your committee, please don't hesitate to reach out to either Scott or Ashlyn. But just wanted to introduce them before we got going here too far. So we do have a presentation about basically how the state of Vermont does its bonding and debt management to date, and then a little bit of information about a pretty good analogous situation that another state found them in with school construction financing, and that's the state of Rhode Island. And I believe from Senate Education that you're having a joint committee meeting to speak with Rhode Island, and I think that is excellent because they seem to have done it right on almost every metric. They had a good collaborative approach with all of the right stakeholders. They sort of got behind a plan. They created a financing mechanism. They leaned on bonding. They viewed it as a once in a generational type investment, but also that bonding incentivized local school districts to come and do their own bonding. So using the state money to leverage local resources. Also tried to incentivize behavior and that I would call strategic at the local level around which school project got prioritized and why they got prioritized. And then thinking about the governance structure of who makes those decisions and how does that live going forward in a sort of more permanent way if this conversation around state aid for school construction will exist for some time, and what does that governance structure look like? So I think those are just some points to drive home before getting into the PowerPoint that you really want to think about the financing, the incentives, the strategic incentives that sort of provide that behavior at the local level that serves everybody well in the long term, and then the governance structure. And we're the Treasurer's office, myself, we're ready, willing, and able to help in any way that we can on this conversation. I think it really, from my vantage point, would be best to have over a longer period of time outside of the legislative process, asking the stakeholders to come together. In Rhode Island, the Treasurer and the Secretary of AOE, for example, co-led that process and brought all of the various entities together, from building and construction trades to local municipalities, members of the legislature, and they came together with a 10-year financing plan with state and local assistance. So with that, I'll just run through sort of an overview of what bonds are, how the state of Vermont issues those bonds, what the trends have been in Vermont to date. And I think probably, as this committee knows, there has been a moratorium on state support for school construction since 2007. There were some projects that were in process, as I understand, at that point that sort of ran off, but there haven't, and the way that the state of Vermont supported local school aid was through bonding. Primarily, I don't believe was out of the general fund, but was out of bonding that the state would issue as part of its annual process of capital expenditure. So that was sort of the process that was in place in 2007 when the moratorium was put into place. So, what is a bond? What does the state do when it issues bonds? You can think of it as it being analogous to a home mortgage. You are making a significant purchase, a long-term, upfront purchase with this money. that maybe you don't have all of the cash at the moment, but you're able to work with a bank and have them finance it for you over a long period of time, 30 years most likely, and you pay it back over that period of time. So you get the immediate upfront benefit of the asset without having to come up with all of the payment upfront, and that can be beneficial for a whole host of reasons. You get the might not have the cash at the moment to pay for it. You might have more attractive interest rates, and you can spend some of that money on other priorities while also making that upfront investment and getting the immediate benefit of that asset. So there's a lot of reasons to consider long-term financing and capital needs, but you can think of it as, in your own personal life, the equivalent of getting a home mortgage to purchase a house rather than paying for that house up front. You might not have the money, or you might not want to spend all your money on the home and have other priorities that you need to meet at the same time. So Vermont bonds have fixed interest rates, like a typical mortgage that you would get. It's not a variable interest rate that sort of adjusts over time. It's a fixed interest rate for the life of the bond. There are some ways that Vermont bonds that we issue are materially different than the example of a home mortgage. The bonds in Vermont are generally issued at 20-year durations. So instead of a 30-year duration with your mortgage, statutorily, Vermont bonds are at 20 years. The state of Vermont, we make payments of interest every 6 months. We make principal payments every 12 months. So just the payment structure, the debt service is a little bit different, where you would be paying interest and principal every month on your home mortgage. We have level principal payments. So these are a situation unlike your mortgage, where you pay more interest up front and then pay more principal on the back end. The principal is a sort of a level payment being paid off over time. So we're paying off more of the principal on our debts here on our bonds in Vermont than your typical home mortgage. And then we can't refinance our bonds generally for 10 years. So they're out in the marketplace at the interest rate that they've been issued for 10 years. Individuals, entities that buy our bonds, they want to make sure that, there's some stability in the price that they're getting and for some amount of duration, so they can bake that into whatever investment returns they need to make. So having that 10-year period of time where we can't refinance, essentially, if the interest rates go in a better direction, that's something that you'll see typically in Vermont bonds that you won't see in your home. You can generally refinance your home when you wish if interest rates move into a better direction for you. Vermont, we guarantee repayment of our general obligation bonds through the general fund. So your individual asset that you're building with the bonds is not the collateral for those debts, unlike a mortgage where your house that you're buying is the collateral for the mortgage. Here it's the general fund as the payment stream if there were a default, not the rest stop or the school or the new building that you're building with the bonding money. That's not the collateral for the asset. And then of course you go to a bank or a credit union to get your home mortgage. In the bond market, there are a considerable number of purchasers, investment banks, significant mutual funds, and then also we always carve out a portion of our bonds for Vermont citizens as well, retail investors. So a whole host of individuals purchasing Vermont bonds when they go out to issue. Going to the next slide, you can see just how the Treasurer's Office plays the central role in that debt issuance. We're responsible for managing the state's bonds by statute, and then you can see sort of what those duties entail, managing the issuance, the sale of the bonds, and then the ongoing administration of the bonds. So paying the interest, paying the principal, what's called the debt service on those bonds, making sure that we monitor our portfolio. If there are opportunities to refinance to get a lower rate, that we might call certain bonds at the appropriate time once those 10-year periods have run their course and we're able to do that. We work with the bond rating agencies and have the ongoing relationship with those agencies. So S&P, Moody's, Fitch, those are the three big rating agencies that rate Vermont. And depending on the rating that we get, that determines the interest rate that we'll have on our debt. And you obviously want to have the highest possible rating you can, because that translates into the lowest possible interest rate and then the lowest cost for taxpayers and Vermonters when we go out and issue our debt. So we do in Vermont have the highest across the board rating in New England. We were AAA previously. Now we're basically one notch below that on all of the credit rating agencies, trying to move our direction back toward, that sort of top level AAA status, and have made some progress to do such, and can talk about that more if people are interested. But the Treasurer's Office is also responsible for getting all of the appropriate individuals that are required to participate in a bond issuance. So the investment advisors, the investment bankers, the lawyers, the rating agencies, economists. There's a whole host of individuals that are involved when the state goes out to issue a bond. We are ensuring compliance with all federal and state law, which is of course critical. And then last but not least, the treasurer is also the chairperson of something called the Capital Debt Affordability Advisory Committee, or CDAC. And we will get into that in a minute, but CDAC basically gives a recommendation as to how much new debt, how much new bonding the state of Vermont can afford to take out in a given year or a given biennium, and still maintain pace with other states from around the country, and not fall disproportionately out of line with the amount of debt that's being taken in Vermont relative to our peer states. So going to the next slide, you'll just see the Vermont. We mentioned the importance of having an excellent bond rating as high as we can get. That achieves the lowest possible borrowing costs, saves money for Vermont taxpayers. Also, a general theme in Vermont debt, we have substantially and continually reduced our outstanding debt since the 1990s, but we're not doing something that's unique. All of the states, particularly our peer-rated states, have been moving in that direction as well, reducing their outstanding debt. So if we are going to continue to keep pace with those states, we would need to continue in that direction. There's about $575 million of general obligation bonds outstanding at the moment, and on an inflation-adjusted basis, that number has been coming down relatively steadily since the 1990s. So on the next slide, we'll talk a little bit about CDAC. I mentioned the Capital Debt Affordability Advisory Committee. It was created by statute in 1989. It is chaired by the treasurer, as I mentioned. The secretary of the administration serves on the CDAC. The member of the Municipal Bond Bank serves on CDAC. And then the governor has 2 appointments to CDAC, and then the treasurer has 1 appointment. So those are the 6 voting members, as well as representation from the auditor, who's a non-voting member, and then a representative from Joint Fiscal Office, who's a non-voting member. And that group meets regularly and comes up with a recommendation. It used to be annually, and now it's per the biennium, about how much net tax supported debt, Vermont, if you think of it this way, Vermont can afford to issue new debt that Vermont can afford to issue. So the benchmarks that this committee primarily looks at are the debt as a percentage of personal income. So how much debt do we have relative to how much wealth is in our state, and that wealth would translate into tax revenue for the state and us being able to service that debt. A more direct look at that number, the debt service as a percentage of revenues. So how much of our revenues are being paid out to service our debt. And then just a per capita look at our debt. What is our debt per capita relative to other states? We recommend, like I said, this group recommends as an advisory opinion every biennium, but it has been historically every single year and every single biennium been adopted by the governor in the capital bill, and then also adopted by the legislature through the legislative process. The rating agencies view this as a good practice for states to have this kind of structure. Some states do it a little bit differently, but many of our peer-rated states, peer AAA states, have a similar structure in place. And then just looking at what that means, what that CDAC report means for this, given this current biennium. On the next slide, for the next 2 years, there's a debt recommendation of $108 million. So that is new debt, $108 million, so $54 million for each biennium. And that represents a reduction of 12% from last biennium's recommendation, and then a 37% reduction from the 2014-2015 biennium recommendation from CDAC. And part of why you're seeing that go down is because, when you look at those other metrics compared to other states are moving in that downward direction as well. Other states, and Vermont is starting to look into this, are trying to pay some of their capital needs with cash up front. So not relying solely on bonding, but also paying for capital projects with cash on hand. And Vermont is starting to look at that process as well. Another unique thing about this year's report, there's a lot of uncertainty in the economy. There is competition with a lot of federal funds that are available at the state and local level in terms of issuing new bonds and getting new projects out. There's a strain on the workforce. There's strain on capital, on the supply chain. Prices are much higher than they were a few years ago. Interest rates are much higher than they were a few years ago. So I think there's a unique moment in time that the CDAC committee considered when presenting this $108 million recommendation. And there was an acknowledgement in this year's recommendation that the second year of the biennium could potentially be revisited if those conditions improve and maybe there's more capacity. But generally, this 108 million that is in this current process that we have, that that would be for all of the capital needs that the state might have, as well. If you're talking about school construction under the current framework, that would be eating into that number too. So, I think that's why the financing component of this conversation is so important, because we'll probably need to try to think of some alternative financing options and try to be creative if we're going to, continue to find a path for having state support for school aid. So you'll see the slide on page 8 that just shows the CDAC recommendation. You can see how it has been going down. The general outstanding debt has been going down too over that time period. The $54 million for each of these 2 years. Also, on the next slide, we already mentioned this, but since 2007, there's been this moratorium on state aid for school building construction. There is an estimated need, and this is a presentation from the Vermont Municipal Bond Bank, which would have a good sense of what the local needs are, of 500 to 600 million. This is an old number, though. It's also a pre-PCB number. So I know that the Agency of Education is doing an audit and eager to see what that total number is in terms of the need out there for both health and safety, as well as maybe potentially some programmatic needs at the local level. And then the bond bank provided a chart there just showing how much school aid had been issued previously in Vermont from 1971 to the present. And certainly you'll want to hear from the bond bank as well as to how, they work this process through with the school districts now, how it worked prior when there was also state aid for school construction, and how they were able to leverage that aid. So certainly the bond bank is an important stakeholder in these conversations. And then just the last 2 slides, again, you'll hear from Rhode Island, but Rhode Island, just want to stress again, I think provided a really good case study for other states to think about how to tackle this problem. They similarly had a moratorium on school construction. That was in 2011. They generally, prior to 2011, when they paid their portion of school construction, it was out of their general fund. They hadn't bonded for school construction since, I think it was 1994. So when they did this analysis and they decided to have a $250 million bond followed by another $250 million bond at the state level, that was not only providing state aid for the first time since 2011, but it was also the first time they had bonded for school aid, school construction aid since 1994. And they, similarly to where Vermont is, we've had a moratorium. Their Department of Education did a schoolhouse report detailing all of the deficiencies in their 300 plus schools. They found about 50,000 deficiencies that both related to health and safety, so hazardous material or fire suppression systems that were inadequate, and also programmatic issues like laboratories not being up to standard or not having laboratories or the type of educational resources that were necessary. And then after that study was done, their treasurer and their secretary of education led a task force of a significant number of stakeholders, but a pretty broad group of individuals to come together and make a plan both for the financing of new school construction and how the state would support that, but also some incentives that I think were really important for Rhode Island. Things like incentivizing school districts that were overcrowded to expand, incentivizing school districts that were undercrowded to consider alternatives, making sure that schools that received state aid, that they maintained a ongoing maintenance fund so they could continue to invest in upkeep that significant investment that was made over time, giving credit for energy efficiency and incorporation of green energy into the projects. So they had quite a bit of strategic incentives built into how they decided which schools received support and in what order. And I think that's an important part of the conversation too. And in Rhode Island, once they committed this plan, they had significant voter support. You can see when they went out with their $250 million bond, they had 76.7% of the vote. And they just recently went out with their other $250 million bond, I believe, or they're planning to do that in the near future. So with that initial investment from the state, they were able to leverage in total over $2 billion in funding for about 200 school projects over about a 4.5-5 year period, with this combination of state general obligation bonds and then other municipal bonds as well. So they also pointed out to us, we had a conversation with Rhode Island to try to understand their process a little bit more. They referenced both the fact that it was a significant job creator for them in Rhode Island, that it was significant for their communities to have good, decent schools so that young families wanted to move to their communities. And they, at least they didn't have, from everything that they can see at this point, a negative impact from the rating agencies. There wasn't, it wasn't viewed negatively the way that they went about funding school construction for Rhode Island. We'd have to take that into account relative to Vermont. So again, I think they are really a really good success story on how they built a roadmap and then how they executed on it. And really just want to emphasize that we are ready, willing and able to help any way that the legislature sees fit to similarly, pitch in on this question as well.
Great. Thank you very much. I think what I heard you say in there, if I read between the lines, is the sort of recommendation is that the state does not exceed 108 million per biennium in new debt. Therefore, state bonding is not necessarily the solution. If we've got from 2020, a $500 million backlog in school construction, you said we probably need to look at alternative financing options. What might those be? I mean, this is kind of the roadblock we hit every time we talk about school construction.
Yeah, I think bonding is going to be part of it. I think that if you have a plan where you understand the full scope of the issue and you can demonstrate that the money is going toward communities that are in the most need and that you're going to see long-term educational benefits, economic benefits, and there's that sort of really comprehensive plan, then I think people get more comfortable talking about putting aid from the state generally, whether that's additional bonding in the future, whether it's just cash from the general fund, whether there's other types of bonds that are able to be issued separate from general obligation bonds, revenue bonds, or something that would be totally creative that we haven't thought of. But I think, financing certainly is going to be one of the most critical parts of this conversation, but I think it becomes easier when you have a comprehensive plan and you know the full extent of the challenges, and it doesn't feel like you're putting money into a black hole that you don't know where you don't know the full extent of the problem, and you don't know what the benefits are that you're getting when you're putting that money there. So I think they play in tandem. That to have that comprehensive plan it makes it a little bit help more easy to figure out how to best finance it.
That's a really important point, because it answers the chicken and egg question. Why are we going to put together a comprehensive plan and a commission if we can't borrow the money? What you're saying is, let's lay the groundwork. That makes the case for more bonding or whatever it might be.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think it's hard to commit to funds of any level if you don't know, you might want to help school district A, but it turns out when you comprehensively look at it, school district B and C have higher needs. And I think you want to have that full approach before, putting the toe back in the water on this conversation.
Yeah. And I guess, so is your message that, with a good comprehensive plan and a really sort of solid framework for appropriating money to school districts, then that 108 million in 2023-24 terms could be exceeded.
Or maybe the CDAC's recommendation would be different in a future biennium. Yeah,
Okay.
We need to look at that differently. Yeah.
You said that in the Rhode Island case study, they were able to leverage additional dollars. What do you mean by that? Does that mean that they were able to go to their version of a municipal bond bank and borrow the remainder?
Yeah, exactly. They can describe this to you, but generally, the local district would do, whether they were bonding or spending partly cash, but they would do the bonding, and then they would come to the state for a portion of that to be paid off prior to 2011, and the state would pay. I think the minimum they're pretty generous. Rhode Island, the structure they had, it was sort of in the 30% range in terms of the total cost, and it could be up to close to 100% depending on the socioeconomic conditions of the various communities. Now, I don't believe they have statewide property collection the same way that we do, so they're different from Vermont, but they would have some generous aid depending on the makeup of the school district. So when I say leverage, what they did here, they did the $250 million bond to have money up front for some of these school districts. And then, let's say it was 20% of the cost, the school district would have to come up with 80%. So they would use some of that bond to help pay for a local school district, when that school district would also come up with significant bonding from their local capacity. So it was really, and they tried to incentivize in this sort of 5-year window of time. They sort of limited the amount of time that a school could come forward with a request to try to, make school districts move and municipalities move in this direction. And so with that 250, I think it was close to or over $2 billion of local funds that came from bonding at the local level.
Representative Brady has a question.
So that, whatever number you just said, that came at the local level bonding was not federal funds due to COVID relief. I'm seeing their plan fell at an incredibly opportune time, and that they were ready to act before this huge trough of federal funds. And I'm wondering if that plays into this at all, or if that's really, I guess maybe that meant they could shift things. I'm just curious if that's has any factor in their success.
I would talk with Rhode Island. I would ask Rhode Island that question.
Yeah.
From the outside, I mean, I think, their plan was in 2017. They went to vote in 2018. So I think they had a track record prior to COVID of getting the money out the door. I mean, they were advantageous in that was a period of time where interest rates were very low and very steady. Yeah. So, that they definitely were fortunate from that perspective. Right now, the interest rate environment's a little bit different, and hopefully starting to improve and move in consistently improved direction, but we just don't know at this time. So I would say that they were more fortunate relative to what the interest rates were than the COVID money. And I don't know if they used COVID money on top of. I didn't see anything. They didn't mention that to us, but I think they really were trying to find a long-term sustainable way to fund this need.
How did it come that you zeroed in on Rhode Island? I've heard Massachusetts held up as a pretty good example. Somebody the other day mentioned Wyoming. What do you know about other states and their ways?
Yeah, so I believe Massachusetts is similarly, could be, valuable example. I think part of what I understand what Massachusetts did was focus on on how the schools were constructed. Like you had, certain school districts had options to choose, and they were sort of limited to A, B, C, D, or whatever they might be, and that was an important part of the Massachusetts plan, because they had some examples of school districts that started to spend a considerable amount of money on projects that the price tag became kind of eye-popping. So they very well could be another state, but the reason that Rhode Island for us became an example is because it was so recent. There was these similarities between having a moratorium for a considerable period of time, having need that was pretty significant, and then finding a pathway forward with a task force just in the last 5 years, and having their treasurer's office be sort of very highly involved in that, just was sort of served as an example of, I think, a good approach.
Representative Minio has a question.
So we're mostly, I guess, talking about state level mechanisms here, but you mentioned a couple of things that come into play at the local level. One was this idea of a level principal payment. And I remember that was an issue for us in South Burlington. We failed so badly at the ballot, we probably would have regardless. But because of that level principal payment, the payments would have spiked in about year 3 at about 33% before averaging about 25 over the rest of the life of the loan. Are we allowed to smooth that out as would happen in a home mortgage? Where does that rule come from?
Scott, I don't know if you have any thoughts on that. And I guess that would have been at the municipal level, right? In terms of that bond structure.
Yeah, I think so. For state GO bonds, we're required to pay at level or diminishing principal payments for the 20 years. So yeah, it could have been a municipal.
Okay. And then the other one for Secretary Pieciak, you mentioned a maintenance fund, but I thought I understood that in school budgets, you're only allowed to roll 100,000 from year to year. So are we actually able to roll a significant maintenance fund as things stand?
Yeah, I guess you might want to check with AOE on that in terms of, I believe it would be some sort of statutory requirement in terms of if there's a limitation on it, but Rhode Island did, I think it was 3% of the amount that they were getting that they were required to put into basically a reserve. And if they didn't, then the state support would end. So it was really, it doesn't need to be those exact numbers, but I think the concept is that you want to make sure the investment that both the state and the local government are making are maintained. So you're not running into a situation where 20 years, 30 years down the road, you need to have a significant expenditure, that the building is being maintained over time. And if there are certain capital needs that need to happen, that there's money available for that.
And so at least in Rhode Island, the maintenance fund was a new thing that was funded by the bonding process. Yeah, okay.
It was a new thing and required if they were going to continue to get state aid, as I understand it.
I just bring up, in our very Vermont unique funding system, one reason you limit what a school can roll over is they're just basically holding money from the state education fund if they do that. However, there are certainly ways around it. You just put it into a capital fund.
Right.
Is Representative Buss?
My question is similar to Rep. Minier's, which is that it does seem like municipal bonds work very differently than this state bond. And is there a way for us to communicate on this particular level to aid school funding? Because I remember hearing that ours would be super front loaded and property taxes would spike up 16%, but then they go down pretty quickly in the first 7 years. And I think it's that initial shock that's really hard for people to get over. And if it were level, like state bonds were, this would be a much easier sell.
Well, I think, Representative, it's a good question to be hashed out in, a task force that has the representatives from the bond bank and treasurer's office and local municipalities to try to think about how, if there were state aid, how would it best be structured to, not create a shock like that in early years. And maybe it's not having the bonds sit alongside for the full duration. Maybe it's something else maybe there's more payments up front relative to the state's portion to help control for that. But I think it's a type of issue that you want to put together the right groups of experts and have them hash that out and come back with some recommendations.
Oh, I have one. Can I ask for the question? I'm sure that we'll study Rhode Island, but how did they figure out how to categorize their $50,000 worth of 50,000 deficiencies? And how did they rank them in order to figure out which schools needed the most, the fastest?
Yeah, so they had a scoring system like you might have on a, if you issued an RFP or something where you had sort of, here are the 6 or 7 categories. And if a state, if a school district had a life and safety issue, or, maybe then they get sort of certain points to be prioritized, or if they were over capacity and their plan addressed that, so they were sort of right sizing their school for their population, then they were getting extra bonus points. If they, like I said, they incorporate, if there's a programmatic issue, like an educational issue, that would get some points. Green, energy efficiency, green energy, they incorporated those concepts. So they did create sort of an incentive structure to try to rank, where to start. And I think that is something else that takes good deliberate thought to come up with and make the right kind of prioritization. Mm-hmm. And I would ask Rhode Island about that, because they would know much better than us in terms of the details of how they landed where they did on those incentives, and how effective they thought they were, if they picked the right ones or not.
The representative from Burlington has a question about school construction.
No, I was just gonna clarify what the answer you just gave. Are you referring to the facility condition index that Rhode Island used? Does that term ring a bell?
It doesn't ring a bell, but I bet you they prioritized as an initial matter, prioritize some of the need in terms of life and safety of their buildings. I think they put them into different categories initially before looking at these incentives of like what needed to be addressed immediately, what was sort of more medium, what was longer term. And I think that might be that concept. So if there were hazardous materials, it would sort of go into the first immediate need category.
What I'm hearing is a lot of questions about Rhode Island, and it makes me think that an hour will definitely not be enough time with our representative from Rhode Island. And by the way, you are cordially invited to join us.
Yeah, no, we will. Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. We wanted to definitely sit in on that.
Great. All right, and I just, getting back to bonding and spikes and all of that, I think I heard you say that is both a function of how the municipal bond bank works bonds and how the state bond bank works as well, that there is that initial sort of spike in the beginning years.
Well, the states have these level payments.
Sorry.
Yeah.
So it's more, there's probably a function of how the municipal bond bank works.
Yeah, I think that's right. And the state and, prior to 2007, I mean, the state and the bond bank worked together, as I understand, on these issues. So, they were able to work together in a way that, satisfied the needs of both entities. So that, again, why they are an important part of this conversation as well, obviously.
Yeah. Any further questions while we have the opportunity, folks? Thanks for your time today, but more importantly, thank you for really shining a light on this and also kind of giving us a potential guide forward in looking at Rhode Island. We're very excited to have them in and talk further about it.
Yeah, same here. And anything we can do to be helpful, I just view this as a critical issue for the long-term success of our state and want to be helpful any way that we can.
Great. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
And thanks to your team for showing up as well.
Yeah, thank you.
All right, folks, you can take us off. And we